The only way to start your day.
So let's look at it as a 3-step, for example, just to simplify. So the aid actors are here, and then you have a government sitting here, and then you have the people sitting down below here. So the aid actors who don't want to strengthen the systems, so that they want the governments to continue coming back to them, what you call begging them. And then the government, for political reasons and, working together with the aid, want to keep the citizens poor. So that then they continue coming for political reasons, including elections. When people are poor, it's easy to manipulate them. Now, and this happens in a system where you have systems that are supposed to be building, and that's what Dustin talked about. Like, why are we not addressing the root causes? It's not that we don't know, and so that brings us to the point of why are disasters recurring in Kenya? It's not like we don't know. We knew it was going to rain. And we know we're going to have a drought in just a few months. But why is that recurring? So it's for the very reason that we want to keep people at the same state continuously so we can control them. And so we cannot build resilience. If it's drought, for example, why not build irrigation systems? If there's flooding, for example, why not abstract that water and use when drought comes, right? And it's not like we don't know these things. We know them. So the very reason for that is so that we keep the status quo.
So if the mother and the father and the nurturer of the aid community is our public finance systems.
Yes.
Would it be prudent, for any government that seeks to serve its people well, to fix that root cause? So that, because I know, and it's funny to hear this, that even in our budget making process, there is room for aid. They say we anticipate there'll be this aid coming. So already that door is open for manipulation. Because even the funds that are set aside for crisis and intervention, they are not accounted for. The efficiency is highly questionable. So would it be fair to expect that a good government will first streamline its financial mechanism measures, its policy, public policy? Because we know, if you are to stick to our country, we know the layout of our country. This area is semi-arid, the Asal region. These are highlands, this is the coastal line, the lake basin, we know. So we know what challenges to expect from those areas. Could be in form of disease, in form of food shortage, in form of just, the landslides and all that. So we do know. So is it the failure of the government in coordination with now the corrupt system they are in that keeps the aid community in business? Because one would ask, why keep giving money where a certain a good percentage of it is going to be pilfered? You will come back and report there was no efficiency because of a corrupt system. But you continue doing this year on, year in for decades. So wouldn't a good government first, if they really want to help the people, and I'm just trying to hammer in the point where you say they keep you poor so they can control you. And I hope you can hear, they keep you poor, not by mistake, so they can control you. Yes, and now when you're too hungry, you're almost dying, they come and give you relief food to keep you alive long enough until the next aid budget comes into play.
And even worse, should you stand up to it and say, actually, we don't need you, then they sanction you to make it seem as though you are anti-development. Do we see here? It's an intricate web of deliberate control. Sounds like the mafia to me. And the last time I checked, they operate illegally. The mafia.
I don't know about the mafia.
I think what you're talking about is really kind of these global dynamics. I think the US is maybe the biggest microcosm or macrocosm of this, of extreme inequality and concentrations of wealth. So for decades, a lot of Western countries, the so-called global north, have pushed this kind of deregulation, extreme inequality to be pushed onto Kenya and many other countries, pushing down trade barriers, having uneven trade practices. And therefore, it's like, okay, we'll give you the scraps from the table, which is a little bit of aid, whether that's humanitarian development or otherwise. But we're going to maintain these deep structural inequalities between so-called global north and so-called global south. And so how does this kind of feed into those systems, and how do you address those deeper structures? When we know a lot of countries, particularly, if we look at South Korea, Japan, they rapidly developed and industrialized through being able to have a strong state that focused on industrialization and development, but that's kind of been kicked away by a lot of global north actors for Kenya and elsewhere. So even things like the ability to tax exports of flowers in Kenya and other industries, that's not effectively taxed. So instead you push all the burden onto the public in terms of income tax, but without addressing the kind of multinational taxes. And this is really kind of critical, yet not really addressed. And how does aid, I think what you're kind of alluding to, and I think is very clear, aid kind of forms part of this political economy that really favours this global north and disempowers the global south in a lot of instances.
Timothy, I don't want to berate or belittle the assistance and what it has done in certain sectors.
Absolutely.
Because we have children, babies, whose lives were saved because aid money came in. We have women who, for maternal things like maternal death, numbers were greatly reduced. We have seed, like the actual seeds that you put in the ground that were preserved as a result of money that came in. My issue is that if the systems that nations have, however you've set them up, were functioning the way that they are supposed to, we wouldn't need it. So we could actually stand up and say, thank you. How about we collaborate on other issues, such as making sure that global taxation was balanced? Then, we can have that conversation. Because I'm not sitting here wondering about whether my nation's babies are dying. I'm not sitting wondering whether people in Makweni will have mature seed to put in the ground in the next rainy season. But so now, you people are going to keep me here dealing with those issues while on the global scale, you're discussing how you're going to come and tax me in the future. I'm saying that if we fix our systems, we can then concentrate on the things that we call unfair in a global space. So that when we're talking about the permanent representative of the United Nations, that we can be having that conversation, because nobody will look at me and say, excuse me, your babies are dying. You can't figure out your health system. You can't figure out how you're going to get medication for those who are living with HIV. Do you see what I'm saying? That we've split it so much that how about we have you trying to figure out these survival things, right? While we discuss how we're going to have a global mechanism for how the value of tea, which you give us, is going to be determined. How the diamonds from Botswana will be dealt on a global scale. How the gold coming out of Ghana or Kenya is going to be dealt. How the cocoa that comes out of Ghana will be sold in Switzerland. Who does not own one cocoa bush? Do you see what I'm saying? That we are kept dealing with these things that are matters of life, death, bread and butter, so that they can have a conversation over here. But if we were allowed and also then insisted on fixing these systems, we could be in those conversations.
Absolutely. I actually wouldn't say we are allowed. Let me just picking from what you say. Because, we don't need permission, really, to fix our systems.
Exactly.
We have our constitution, we have the legal frameworks, we have everything else. And at the beginning, I mentioned, how the humanitarian, like how our legal frameworks anticipated that we will have humanitarian systems or crises or emergencies, and how do we deal with it? Now, we have systems, and just tying that with a question, we have systems, but I think we are kept busy, dealing with problems, than, we don't have time to deal with these bigger global problems. Now, let's look at, just translate that into some form of, or explain how the systems exist. Now, in Kenya, we don't lack legal frameworks.
No.
We don't lack resources. And I can show you that. In 2024, we moved 75 billion from development budget to response at the national level. This year alone, just a few months ago in January, through the first supplementary budget that went to Parliament, there's 13.5 billion that's available for disaster, and that is the special programs, State Department budget moving from 654 million to 13.5 billion just to respond to disasters. Now, here you have a government that has the resources to actually respond. Now, this is like you're moving money from a budget. Let's go back to the instruments that we set up for ourselves. So if we have a national drought, emergency fund at national level, because the fund is supposed to sit outside the budget, why not resource it when you know already drought is going to happen, right? So that then you don't end up in this crisis of moving money and going to donors and asking them to give you money because you have instruments. At the county level, you have an emergency fund. This emergency fund should contain at least 2% of your total revenue every year. And so it's supposed to accumulate. Now, why not resource that and make it available when disaster doesn't happen? Let it accumulate. So that then when you need it, then you can go to your instruments. So instead, it is by design that we don't operationalize our systems. The legal frameworks, which of course talks about accountability, how do we account for it, how do we manage it, and so forth, and then how do we respond to disasters and how do we finance it. So that then when disaster happens, then we run around, looking for money from donors and from our budget, which means sacrificing something else in our budget to respond to disasters. And coming back to status quo, is that it's very interesting for political class and humanitarian actors and the budget actors that this crisis remains, so that then the money that we move from development to crisis is very invisible. Like that black box. I mean, it's very difficult for anyone to see. We haven't seen any. in the counties that I've been, I haven't seen a list of beneficiaries. I haven't seen how the emergency fund was spent. So that means when money goes there, no one knows
how it was spent.
Yeah.
Now, Dustin, we are going into the last quarter of the financial year. And there'll be rapid financial movement because people need to exhaust the coffers and then raise budgets for the next cycle. Do we continue to expect the same old same? Because we seem to be clear on what the problem is. We understand the aid industry is an industry that wants to the status quo to remain so they can remain in business because this is where they source the funds from. And, if you dig backwards, you realize some of them are trying to have tax exemption from their mother countries. Others are trying to diverse resources. Others is illicit financial movement. A lot of things, play in the back room before you are presented with a check of an aid. Then when it is received here, our public financial management system also are not prudent. Okay, we have enough laws, I do agree, but we are not prudent enough in matters of practice. So the problem is clear. And unfortunately, we use humans to sustain this trade. We use humans who should be the benefactors, the beneficiaries, to pilferage money. And now you have the backhand of the beneficiaries, the mega, at the mega level is a whole different conversation. You realize $1 billion USD might be raised, but only 300 million will get to the purported benefactor or beneficiary. So today we understand that problem. You generated a very solid report. Your organizations are trying to mop up information to see how do we now shape up the next best policy that will benefit people more and preferably have better utilization of resources. Is there hope for that change? Are these reports being consumed appropriately by the intended recipients? And what is the best course of action for both, maybe from the government and the aid industry?
Hopefully the reports go viral. At ODI Global, where I work, and Institute of Public Finance Kenya, we put a lot of effort into kind of bringing these conversations together. I remember being on a podcast about 2.5 years ago, and they're like, okay, at the end of 2023, before the world went even crazier, what do you want to be talking about in the future? And I was like, so boring, but I want to talk about tax and bringing tax and humanitarianism together. And then 2.5 years later, we're in this room talking about these kind of critical issues. So that's exciting. I think within the humanitarian and the broader aid sector, we need to recognize it's not a homogenous beast, and there are a lot of actors. Oxfam in Oxfam Kenya is doing a lot to kind of address these governance dynamics. They've done a lot of great work on inequality. ODI Global, where I work, we're also trying to push this kind of governance lens, engaging politically within the aid sector. So we need to be responsible of not just going, okay, let's cut off all the aid and then that will be better, but how do we responsibly transition. But I think a lot of what you're talking about, there's just so many vested interests in maintaining the status quo. From the head of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, Tom Fletcher, is pushing this very detrimental narrative around, let's make humanitarianism back to basics, let's push more food, cash, all these simple things, and disengage from these broader governance issues. And I think that is hugely detrimental to the sector writ large. And I think it's also important, there are many donors that I engage with at a lot of different levels, across Western Europe and elsewhere. And they do have a genuine interest in improving the way things work and supporting Global South governments and changing the way aid operates. But there are a lot of global power structures at play, and just recognizing that the Trump administration in the US is really causing so many problems. If we look at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was kind of one of the most extreme examples of this weaponized, politicized aid that led to, a lot of Palestinians, Gazans being killed. And so you've got this kind of negative OCHA and US kind of drive in a certain direction, but then there are a lot of more principled actors going, no, we need to come together, do things with collective action, solidarity. And I think that's really important, that we don't just dismiss everything, but how do we bring different actors together in the way that we are coming together today and speaking about our reports and kind of collaborating with humanitarian focus, but also public finance and tax focus. So I think that's really important. And also with the youth, I think youth-led activism is so critical. You've seen it in Kenya and elsewhere. But how do you build alliances from, maybe urban centres where a lot of youth are concentrated and quite active, but also talking about the arid and semi-arid lands, and build this collective action to address these deep structural issues, deep structural inequalities.
Well, Kip, this is interesting.
Yep.
You take it as you may.
Yeah, sure.
If the body of Jesus Christ was found today,
Okay.
the whole Christian religion would collapse. Or if the devil got saved today, the whole faith ministry will collapse. Public finance management, if you strengthen your systems and the countries are more focused on offering a better public policy, the aid industry would collapse. You see the connection?
Yep.
So, what direction Kenya moving forward?
Yep. Very interesting question, and I'm happy that you asked that question because that's where the solution lies.
Right.
Our PFM system is very strong. It provided the processes, it provided the systems, it recognizes disasters and emergencies. So it means we just need to operationalize it. So we need to turn the architecture of our legal framework into systems. And these systems, in my view, will do three things. Be ready to respond when disasters happen. And that is the rapid response mechanisms that we have, emergency fund, disaster risk, management funds. And then kind of learn from what we do. When we respond to disasters once, twice, there are lessons we learn. And flood, for example, if you respond twice, you can already see a pattern of what is causing the flooding, or drought, for example. Then use that as a lesson and think about how do we invest then in prevention. And that's where kind of adaptation, to climate problems comes into play. And we have systems for that. The county climate change funds, for example, exist to do that, to serve that purpose, learning from how we respond, using the lessons, and think about what then systems do we need to put in place. So if you look at that ecosystem, is that we have emergency funds that sit as a reinsurance. The same way you have an health insurance, right? But you still go to the gym. The purpose is that to keep yourself fit. Now, but you say, well, if the gym is not helping me, then I have an insurance to fall back to. So it's the same thing. Emergency fund is more of our insurance kind of system. Climate adaptation investment is more of the practice and getting fit and being a child or a child to the systems that we are anticipating to face. So we need to operationalize that system,
right.
And our PFM has provided the infrastructure for that, so that then we don't lack that for a start. And then our citizens, just one minute, our citizens and civil society need to step up. We have a responsibility to pay tax. we are taxpayers before we are, subject to emergencies and crises. Now we need to follow that money, and we also voters. When we elect leaders, we surrender part of the power, and that we remain with part of it. We need to exercise the part of it that we have, holding accountable parliament, county assemblies, and the executives on how they use the taxes that we have before humanitarian aid comes.
Wow. And better yet, getting the right persons in office.
Yep.
So, Justin, perhaps, there's always potentiation even of medication. Now, when aid comes into play, it generates other crises. I don't know whether that is noted. Because sometimes we hear they're extending humanitarian aid, which ends up being in form of guns that sustains a war. We have over 50 conflict areas now in the world. And most of those countries or those areas, they don't manufacture guns. It is aid, in quotes or not. So how do we connect the dots? That, you sustain a war, people are going to go hungry. You have seen the desertification of the Gaza Strip, So now you need to do the whole reconstruction of the housing. People need to know where to get food. So you can always see the subsequent crisis that will come from whatever it is you're trying to deal with now. But again, it depends on the interest.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.